I am a second-generation immigrant to these lands, a settler of Chinese descent. I would like to first and foremost acknowledge that the work that we do takes place on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, which is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Our regional hubs and partners across Canada similarly gather on the traditional territory of many of Canada's Indigenous nations who have cared for these lands since time immemorial. On a personal note, I am in the process of unlearning and have committed to doing more work in listening, reflecting upon our history and the role that we have all played in upholding the inequities of our society. I'm committed to developing new connections and ensuring that these are nurtured on an ongoing basis from a place of truth and respect. So for today's panel, whether it's artificial intelligence or automation, we regularly read about the impacts of disruptive technologies and the ways in which this impacts the future of work. While the focus is often on jobs that will change as a result of technology, such as taxi drivers being replaced by Uber drivers, we read much less about how technology might be used to address aspects of the other side of the coin, the skills gap. Because of COVID-19 and physical distancing, so many businesses of all sizes have been forced to become almost digitized completely, making technology skills more important than before. Technologies such as data analytics, AI, mobile communications, and virtual and augmented reality provide infinite possibilities to assess and develop skills, provide better align supply and demand, and create more inclusive, productive, and healthy workplaces. Tech-enabled innovations in the skills and employment ecosystem is the most recent report in the Skills Next series from the Diversity Institute, Future Skills Center, and Public Policy Forum, which looks at these very issues and opportunities. Today, we will first hear highlights from the report findings presented by two of the report authors, followed by what promises to be a lively panel discussion on how technology and innovating skills, training, and employment. It's now my pleasure to introduce authors of the report, Wendy Cukier and Stephen Harrington. Wendy Cukier is the Professor of Entrepreneurship and Strategy and Academic Director of the Diversity Institute at the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University. Dr. Cukier is one of Canada's leading experts in disruptive technologies, innovation processes, and diversity and inclusion. Stephen Harrington is Deloitte's National Lead Workforce Strategy and has been a writer and speaker on the future of work since 2011. With 20 years experience in consulting, Stephen leads transformations in workforce strategy that enables people to feel personal purpose and impact as the business drives improved results. Please join me in welcoming Stephen and Wendy.
Thanks so much. And Stephen, I think you're going to kick it off, and I will do my best to manage the slides. Can everybody see the slides?
Looks good.
Okay.
So thanks for arranging this today, our friends at the Diversity Institute and everyone who's shown up for this discussion. I'm just glad we could find a day where there's nothing else going on in the world of any political import. So yeah, today we just want to walk through this conversation about where we're going to go with skills development, in particular, how the technology ecosystem as it develops can really help us leverage that future. And we're going to spend a little bit of time off the top. I think we're speaking to the converted, but it's still worth going over the business case for why we need to change and why we need to change at pace. We'll talk a little bit about where we are at today, some of the success stories we're seeing in the market, and how this technology piece can really help bridge the gap. And no conversation these days would be complete without us referencing COVID as well. We're going to try and tidy that all up in 20 minutes or so and get to the panel. So why change? One of the things that we're seeing in the market right now is, if you advance this, Wendy, one more, that even though in the last decade around the world we have invested more than ever in technology, trillions of dollars in fourth industrial revolution technologies, we're actually seeing a decline in productivity in most major economies. And we have a hypothesis as to why. A lot of these technologies are failing to impact fundamentally the way work is being done. The job itself, the work itself is not turning over. And one of the main reasons for that is the software that runs the human system, the skills, they are not keeping pace. If we advance again. We did a little bit of rough math here at Deloitte. We have really great access to data in Australia, and we're able to do some math to find out that they have about a $36 billion hole in their market when it comes to skill shortages by 2030 if they do nothing differently than they are today. First of all, Australia is a great comparison to Canada, so you can think it might be similar. And then if we look at that globally, that's a $2.9 trillion problem. So we better address that, right? A couple of quick words about skills themselves. This is commonly known, but I want to underline a point that, again, by 2030, we are going to see an increase in higher cognitive skills, social, emotional, and technological, what you sometimes think of as advanced digital skills. But notice, in technological, basic digital skills are also increasing. Those might be things like basic RPA, basic Excel. Those skills are still in increased demand. And also notice that below the line, though there is a decrease in physical and manual and basic cognitive, it's not an elimination. So we just have to remember that the skills landscape remains quite complex. This just describes that it's shifting. One of the estimates is that about 50% of skills in the workforce today will need to be updated in the next 6 years, to give you an idea of the scale of the problem and some of the math I showed you earlier. And then finally, the last point I'll make is to draw a distinction on the next slide, Wendy, which I believe is my last one in this little preamble, between technical skills and what we sometimes refer to as future-proof capabilities or enduring capabilities. Technical skills we've often called hard skills. I really wish we'd stop it. Can everyone here agree to stop it? They're actually, I might call them brittle skills, because what's happening is the half-life of these technical skills is now anywhere between 2.5 to 5 years. This is underneath the problem we're trying to solve here today. We need to be able to, technical skills are still obviously important, but we need to be able to turn them over more quickly than we've ever done before. Enduring capabilities are worth talking about today because they're timeless. Once we build them, they stay with you through your whole career. Those could be skills like influence or setting direction or understanding the architecture above the work that you do, how things fit together. Those things don't turn over, and we really need to pay attention to building them.
So where are we today? One of the things that I think is critically important, there's been a lot of what I think both of us would call hype around the impact of technology and often research around the disruption that technology can wreak is overstated. Just because automation can make a difference does not mean it will. And to Stephen's point about the productivity paradox, we know there are lots of technologies available, but they're often not being well implemented. We wanted today to really focus, though, not on the disruption that technology can bring, but rather how technology can be a really important part of the solution when we look at bridging the skills gap, when we look at creating an inclusive innovation system. And so we want to talk a bit today about ways in which technology can provide innovative solutions to the assessment, the identification, the development, the utilization of skills, ways in which technology can help create more inclusive, productive, and healthy workplaces. And of course, there is always a dark side, and I know our panelists will talk about that as well, but technology does have the potential, at least, to help reinforce inclusion. Technology has the potential to better bridge the growing skills gap. And one of the things that for me is really important is to recognize that some employers are looking for skills in all the wrong places, and that the issue is not that the skills don't exist, it's that they don't know where to find them. And so using technology to better identify where there are people with the assets that can fill your needs is another huge opportunity. And then, of course, building capacity. One of the things, and Stephen sort of alluded to this, but the pace of change with technology has been, of course, known to all of us for a long time, but COVID has really accelerated this. And the fact Shopify is the largest company in Canada now is very much a function of the fact that COVID has really accelerated the adoption of technology in everything from education to healthcare, to retail, to manufacturing. Things that we knew were stalled. And in fact, the last time Stephen and I spoke, I was talking about how it's taken 30 years for electronic health records to actually gain traction. That was pre-COVID. Things we'd been waiting decades for happened literally overnight. And that has really amplified these issues. We know that pre-COVID issues around the ability of employers to find skilled employees was a real concern, and it was mostly acute among small medium enterprises, which, as you know, account for 90% of the jobs in Canada. It's not any less difficult post-COVID. We also know that that the research, and there have been more recent studies with this, and Stephen already alluded to it, candidates with technical skills are still very much in demand. And I'm really pleased that Stephen did highlight something that I think is critically important. When we talk about digital skills, often people think digital skills are synonymous for more engineers and computer scientists. And of course we need those. Stephen, you are in demand. However, the fact remains that the demand for digital skills at that level, what we would call deep digital skills, is not the dominant demand. And a recent OECD study, for instance, showed that most companies in Ontario wanted digital skills. But when you unpack that, only about 10% of those skills related to deep programming and development skills. 75% of which they defined as digital skills was Microsoft Office, use of Excel, use of ERP systems. And I think it's really important because while coding is a very valuable skill to have, so is the ability to use basic applications. So is the ability to match technology to organizational needs. And the productivity paradox is more driven by the fact that we don't have people who can perform those bridging functions, who can drive the adoption of technology, who can support organizations in implementing even simple platforms like Shopify, than it is necessarily a function of the lack of coders. And I think that's something we have to keep in mind. The other point that I couldn't let pass without addressing is we do know that certain segments of the population with skills that could be utilized in the workplace face barriers. We know that 44% of internationally educated engineers, for example, are underemployed. And those stories of engineers driving cab and working as security guards are not just apocryphal. We also know, and the evidence is really clear, that applicants with foreign sounding last names, even if they're born and educated in Canada, are 20% less likely to get interviews with large corporations, 30% less likely to get interviews with SMEs. That's really a problem. We know there are still issues with women, and COVID has accelerated those. 30% of women are considering not returning to work. They've been crushed by the burden of unpaid labor. University graduates with severe disabilities have worse employment outcomes than high school dropouts. If you've graduated from university, chances are there is a role for you somewhere. But again, we see that people are really underutilized. And of course, a huge opportunity in Canada is the rapidly growing Indigenous population. We also know that when it comes to issues around upskilling and reskilling, Canada, excuse me, Canadian corporations in general underinvest in training for their employees. We see that large organizations, for example, rather than retraining their employees, will focus on things like hiring new people, leveraging contractors and outside employers, relying on gig workers. And reskilling has got to be one of our top priorities in the new environment. The other thing that, again, I'll just underscore is the skills and employment ecosystem is not just about developing new skills. It's not just about fixing the job seekers or your current employees. It's also about developing inclusive work environments which take advantage of the skills that people have. It's also about an asset-based approach where we look at the skills people have, we look at the skills that we need, and we figure out how to use innovative techniques to bridge those gaps. And it's also about innovative approaches to recruitment. I don't, all of you can read the reports, and this is really building on an earlier report we released a few months ago that focused on reskilling practices, as well as the most recent report. But I just wanted to highlight some success stories. There is really good evidence that investments in upskilling and reskilling can make a big difference. And while it's anecdotal, while we don't have good uniform data, there are at least enough use cases to say, if you invest appropriately, you can get a return on investment, sales growth, retention of employees, increased productivity, and so on. We also know that business owners think that training is important. It's just that many of them do not invest. And particularly in small companies, often the focus is really on informal training rather than formal training. I'll just take a breath there to ask Stephen if he has anything that he would like to add at this point before we dig in a bit deeper.
Yeah, I think organizations are really starting to recognize that the pace of skill change required means that we can't use 20th century approaches to learning anymore. If you buy some of the data I showed you off the top, who can afford to replatform, even if it's 40 or 30% of the skills in their workforce, if we don't begin to do it fundamentally differently? Learning in the flow of work is a big part of that. So thinking differently, how we create these bite-sized and work integrated experiences. Very hard to do that without the tech ecosystem though, which is why we're leaning into that today.
Thanks. So, again, in the earlier report, we documented case studies that are almost legendary now. One of the biggest ones was AT&T's reinvestment in its employees. It spent $1 billion. And it's one of the few companies that actually really measured the return on investment in terms of reduced life cycle, getting product to market, changes in sales and revenues, and so on, not to mention goodwill. Amazon has invested heavily in retraining its employee workforce, and so have some retailers like Walmart and others. Cognizant's one of my favorite because they've developed some really innovative approaches. They can produce a full stack Java developer in 6 to 8 months, whether or not the person has any previous experience in computer science. Those are some of the models that I think are the most impressive. Financial services, both in the US and Canada, are investing heavily because they recognize that the old skills won't cut it anymore. And we really see technology companies, financial services companies, consulting firms, those that put a high premium on human capital and brain power among the leaders in this space. So to go to the guts of the report, we really looked at the issues around the role that technology can play. through the life cycle, whether we're talking about the development of skills, and most people know about online learning opportunities, but it also can play a really important role in accessing skills, in helping to identify where talent lies, both within the organization and without. It can help do assessments, ways of testing existing skills and the gaps between those skills and what is needed to really chart a path to upskilling. And from our perspective, pushing more and more towards objective measurements of skills will do nothing except increase inclusion, because we know that very often people use proxies to assess skills. You went to the same university that I went to. You speak without an accent. You worked here, you work there. And very often we're missing opportunities to take advantage of people who have skills. Shopify is one of the first organizations, for example, to basically start overlooking formal academic credentials and focusing on customized skill testing. We're seeing lots of organizations looking at new ways to create paths for people that may not rely on traditional academic credentials. And then, of course, we know that there are also ways, and this is something, of course, near and dear to my heart, to better utilize skills within organizations, to use technology to create more inclusive environments. And our panel will definitely dive into this more deeply. I'm not going to go through this because it's, as Stephen pointed out, it's not like we're picking favorites. It's just the intent of the report was really to provide a bit of a framework and make sure people understand the extent to which technologies currently exist, the extent to which technologies are currently being used for everything from mapping to gap analysis to benchmarking to tracking credentials to recruiting and so on. And it's not that this is intended to be a playbook for corporations or organizations looking at upskilling, but more to get people to think broadly about the opportunities that there may be to leverage technology to build these skills. And so,
yeah, Wendy, I just might add a point there. Like, to me, that framework that you were just looking at in those few examples, underneath that, there are dozens and dozens of other examples. And the challenge and the solution are in the same bucket right now. The solution is utilizing these technologies, many of which are cheap and cheerful, unbelievably affordable. Now, this is not just about large employers as an opportunity, but the challenge is building, ironically, the skill and capability to be able to identify these sorts of solutions, build them into a digital architecture that connects, and really start to utilize them. Even large legacy employers are really struggling to learn how to do that. And that's why we thought a framework to understand the ecosystem was so important.
I agree. And it's funny because, I still remember user-driven method from, I think, 1986, which talked about always starting from what it is you're actually trying to accomplish in the user experience and pathways. And we still, to this day, see organizations thinking that if you build it, they will come, glomming onto technological solutions that don't actually meet their needs. So I agree with you completely. We have lots of stuff that's going on in Canada, lots of organizations that are bridging the issues of inclusion and innovation and trying to use new technologies to do that. And Stephen, maybe you can talk a little bit more in the remaining minutes about some of the implementation issues that you see.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the chief one is the one I just described. So we need to build those people with those skill sets. But I think, that really starts with leadership insisting upon looking into these ecosystems, trying things and potentially failing them, and turning. The other thing you need to recognize about these light and technologies is that you'll turn them over more quickly. It's not like investing in an ERP you'll be in for 15 years. So you need to build a strategy about that. We need to assess and integrate these solutions, and keep an eye on, as Wendy mentioned, that ultimate experience for your employees and as a proxy to your customers or citizens that are being impacted by this lift in capability that you're shooting for. Yes, and of course, all of this is happening in the context of COVID. The one thing I'll say, I know we're right about a time, the context of COVID is particularly interesting in that it's actually surfacing a whole new set of skills that far more people than we ever anticipated need. And those are all of the skills related to making remote and hybrid work arrangements possible. There is an estimate that's about 60% of the Canadian workforce that's going to be impacted, even post-COVID, by these changes in ways of working. And those are fundamentally different ways. Even the skills that we have that are not related to remote work, in some cases, will have to adjust. So unfortunately, that just adds to the lift. But what a great opportunity to put a nice big red circle around the importance of learning through COVID.
And if I can just add to that, Stephen, it does have implications for inclusion, both positive and negative, because some people are well equipped. I have a big house, I have high-speed internet. For me, working at home is not a problem. But I had students who were working in their cars because they had to get away from their children. I had people who didn't have air conditioning, who simply were not equipped to work at home. The flip side of that, though, is more flexible work arrangements do suit many people, particularly those who are juggling family obligations with work. And one of the principal demands for people with disabilities in terms of more inclusive work environments is the ability to work from home and the ability to have more flexible hours. So this could actually open up real opportunities for people with disabilities.
Yep.
Doing things that corporations previously said were impossible, because if I can't see you, you can't be working.
You know, Wendy, you're gonna get me all wound up on this topic. You know how passionate I am about it. There's a real, if we leave the opportunity on the table, we won't forgive ourselves to get rural, remote, and hard to employ Canadians into the market, both through remote work, but also a growing and healthy gig economy. Yeah.
So that wraps up our sort of presentation on the reports. We'll send the links out. We hope that you will take the time to read them and follow up with us, because this is, it's speaking on behalf of the Future Skills Center and the Diversity Institute in particular, as well as our partnerships with Deloitte, with the Public Policy Forum and others. This is an ongoing area of focus and interest, and we're not just doing the research. We're trying to develop and test solutions that can be scaled to transform the ecosystem. So we would love to hear more from all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wendy and Stephen. Really insightful, and particularly can relate to the point about new skills and competencies being identified during this time of remote work, and thinking about the overall long-term impacts and immediate impacts of the pandemic. We are now going to move on to our panel for further discussion and provide some examples of how this research is translating into real-world examples and experiences. Joining us today is Paula Allen, who is the Senior Vice President of Research, Analytics, and Innovation for Morneau Shepell. In this role, she manages the continuum of integrated analytics, predictive modeling, and data-centric products and services that support the organization and its clients. Paula's focus is on the current, emerging, and most complex issues that have the greatest impact on workforce health, cost, and productivity. And Namir Anani is the President and CEO of the Information and Communications Technology Council. He is the chief strategist and driving force in bringing ICTC's world-class centers of expertise and services to industry, education, and government, enabling Canada's advancement as a leader in innovation and productivity in the global economy. Robert Luke is CEO of eCampusOntario, a nonprofit organization that aims to strengthen Ontario's post-secondary education system by increasing access to online learning. Previously, Robert was Vice President of Research and Innovation at OCAD University, and before that, George Brown College. Mark Patterson is the Executive Director at Magnet, where he oversees a network of post-secondary institutions, not-for-profits, government, labor, and industry partners working together to tackle pressing labor market challenges by leveraging cutting-edge technology to match talent to opportunity. Mark is also co-author of the report. As well, report co-author Wendy Cukier of the Diversity Institute returns to moderate the panel. After the panel, we'll have a few minutes to answer questions from the audience, so feel free to go ahead and enter them in the Q&A box on Zoom. Over to you, Wendy.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate your help, Elaine. So just to kick it off, I wonder if each panelist in turn, maybe in the order Elaine introduced you in, could provide some introductory comments in terms of your perspective, given what your organization does, about the drivers and impediments to upskilling, reskilling, and ensuring, and this is important to all of us, that companies have the workers they need, but also that workers have the opportunities that they deserve. You want to kick that off, Namir?
Sure, happy to do that. And thank you for the invitation and being part of this pivotal discussion. I think at a high level, there are two factors, actually it was mentioned in your report, aspects of it, two factors that are governing the upskilling and the reskilling. On the upskilling side, clearly the changing nature of work and predominantly as a result of digital adoption and disruptive technologies and that. And obviously we've seen the acceleration of adoption in the last couple of months, more than that happened in the last number of years as a result of the COVID pandemic. And obviously accelerated also by the working from home, because the way we transact with our economy is changing online, and hence forcing many of the companies to move into a digital sphere. So we've seen the retail moving into e-commerce, the health into telemedicine, that manufacturing into advanced manufacturing, robotics and automation, banking, and the list goes on. So obviously upskilling becoming a critical component, not only for companies to survive, but also to thrive in a global environment going forward. And obviously that's on the mind of many businesses, as how to create a future-proof environment going forward. On the reskilling side, I think we have to look at the changing nature of our economy. We are seeing fundamental structural change to our economy, brought about by global competition, by trade dynamics, by environmental trends that are also forcing many of the companies, positioning many of the companies to think in a sustainable business. And we've seen the growth in the demand also of connected and electric vehicles, smart cities, advanced manufacturing, and all of the capabilities that these brought in the fintech and others. And obviously, many of economies, as in Canada, are starting to reflect, well, how do we transition the workforce from where they are currently to growth economies? Specifically, as an organization, we've done a lot of work in that space, and we've seen, even during the COVID environment, that the digital workforce is very resilient, and in fact, outpaces other sector of the Canadian economy by 4-to-1, the growth in that space. So obviously, we have to reflect the cumulative impact of upskilling and reskilling. It's going to be critical in the next number of years. And I would say the academic institutions play a critical role into this, in future-proofing our workforce, because our ability to create short duration training on this is going to be critical. I must mention, and I will close on that, there are programs that we administer as much as others, the Work Integrated Learning program on behalf of the government, that actually creates work experiences for post-secondary education to help them integrate and hit the ground running when they get into the industry. But happy to expand on that and expand on many of the discussions going forward.
Thanks so much, Namir. Paula, do you want to weigh in and talk about your practice and what you see?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, thank you for the presentation and the report. There was certainly many pivotal things in there. I was very, very happy to see that you had called out social and emotional skills, as well as higher cognitive skills, as being pretty critical. Because when you think about what we want with all of this, we want our businesses to be competitive, we want our businesses to be productive, we want our businesses to take advantage of everything that is available in order to advance and progress society as well as their own sphere. Mm-hmm. not just about the technical skills. I mean, we all have seen situations where people had high technical competence and weren't able to move forward. We know that, it is difficult for people to live in the environment that we have and that we are looking to accelerate, because that environment has rapid change. So we're just skilling people, and with a full knowledge that the skills that they have will be somewhat out of date by the time they finish what they're doing. That doesn't fit well with a lot of people's psychologies. The rapid disruption that we've had as a result of COVID, the change, the uncertainty, that's really just an intense example of what we are actually moving into and wanting to have, because that will be what gives us the advancement. So I do think it is important, actually I think it's critical for organizations to understand this aspect of how they need to support their people. And the good thing is, I do think it fits in a skills conversation, because you can shape how people look at things. You can shape how people incorporate information and respond to change. It is multifaceted and requires leadership and culture, and again, all these things that can be introduced into an organization. But I do think we will fail if we don't take that quite seriously. So organizations understanding, number one, and on the other hand, making sure that we do something about it and put as much weight into that capability to be successful in a disruptive environment as we're putting into the skills that are necessary for that disruptive environment. So much to say about that, but I'll leave that as my opening comment.
That's great. Thank you so much. And Robert, do you want to weigh in at this point?
Yes, please. Thank you, Wendy and Stephen, and for your introduction, and thank you also for including me. I think, the points that Paula and Namir have brought up are very important, and I think we should take a step back and realize that technology is not neutral in this environment. And Wendy, you alluded to this when you talked about inclusion and diversity. And I think even the foregrounding of our entire talk today with our land acknowledgement and realizing that the job of decolonization is really central and important. And also Stephen's point about COVID being majorly disruptive is that those experiencing marginalization in our society, as we know, are experiencing an exacerbation of that marginalization due to COVID-19. And that we don't all have the privilege of isolating or being in our home offices in order to attend this kind of environment. So I think that's very important to kind of start as a base. But I just want to come back to this idea of technology is not neutral. The report that you produced is fantastic. I actually learned about a lot of technologies I did not know about. But all of those technologies have baked in biases in them. Those biases include the ability to access them. So do I have the bandwidth to use them? Do I have the skills in order to do that? The receptor capacity of a company, let's say, as one of the comments came up about, small companies don't have the, $1 billion to invest like Bank X or B did. That idea of receptor capacity is very important. And I think that receptor capacity includes something else that was just mentioned, which are those human skills about learning and learning, I would say learning resilience. Paula's point actually, I think is really trenchant here because, if we don't teach people the ability to learn and also the expectation that they will be learning all the time, then we're doing everybody a disservice because we all know that we have to learn new skills. We all had to adapt to the big pandemic pivot, and we all know that it's going to be thus for quite some time. But I have a lot of other things that I think will come up, particularly around things like micro-credentials and iterative learning. It was a very interesting comment on the gig economy. But I just want to come back to this idea that technology is not neutral. AI is great. We all know that it's going to be, something that will help a lot of things. There's going to be a lot of disruption, obviously, but AI has baked in biases as well. And if we don't take care to design from the margins and look at the edge cases for how we stand up these systems, then the obverse is that we just design to the mean. And we literally will regress to that mean. Right? Those kinds of systems work best when we have as much data as possible to tell us what is most useful and usable. And that can cause us to ignore those who exist on the margins of our society, be that cultural or ability or otherwise. So I think it's very important for us to be aware of that, to kind of frame this discussion of technology. It's not just a panacea, but there are human actors here who are making these technologies and human actors who need to enact them.
Thanks so much. Really, really good points. And, we could have a whole session just on, in fact, we will, on the impact of COVID in terms of increasing marginalization, the importance of broadband access or other platforms to even be able to participate in some of these new opportunities. So thanks for bringing that up. Mark, over to you.
Yeah, thanks again, Wendy. I think what's interesting, all of the points, considering all the points that have already been made, I'm going to try and take a slightly different tack and look at the system broadly in Canada. We have a very extensive publicly funded system with thousands of organizations across the country that work in communities trying to support transition and training and upskilling of people. We have a large post-secondary sector with 197 publicly funded institutions, not counting private career colleges across the country. And then we have all of the reskilling and upskilling and training of employers trying to reskill and upskill and retool their workforce. And I think one of the biggest challenges, we also live in a country with 13 provinces and territories, all with a mandate around employment and skills training. And there's a lot of amazing innovation happen, but as came out in the presentation, and I think Stephen alluded to, even for a large company to try and understand all of the different types of technology, to bring them together into some kind of holistic solution to address reskilling, upskilling is really challenging. I think we need to, as a country, be thinking about the digital infrastructure that we have that's open and inclusive, that will bring and allow new technologies to be plugged into that infrastructure, and that can be provided to address some of these issues. When we look at what has brought the country together before, you could use an analogy of the railroad or the Trans-Canada Highway or whatever you want. But unless we work together on that, you could have a proliferation of railroad companies building different track sizes and everything else, and nothing's going to work together. You could have, a highway where if you drove from one province to another, maybe you had to drive on the opposite side of the road. And I think we're faced with that in the employment and skills and reskilling and upskilling space. We need to think nationally. You look at projects coming together, there's no one technology solution that's going to be a panacea for all of these problems. It's going to be a collection of technologies working together. And if I was scanning through the list of participants, there's people on the list of participants representing, challenge platforms and learning management systems and mental health support systems and labor market information. How do we bring it all together, I think, is one of the biggest challenges that we'll face, and how do we make it accessible for all the groups that Robert also spoke to and alluded to? And how do we layer onto that supports around, building the soft skills and the social emotional skills and all of the other things that have already been mentioned. But I think we need to come together as a country around a digital infrastructure that's open and inclusive and can accept in an ongoing way new emerging technologies and innovations.
Mark, I think that's very well said, and it really is the vision for the Future Skills Center that you and I think started with, was the idea that we have the elements of a very powerful skills and employment ecosystem, but the fragmentation is actually a problem. And it's not just fragmentation when it comes to the technical bits. It has to do with fragmentation around, reinventing the wheel on English language training and or digital skills or other things. Like there are a whole series of points at which, if we could come together, and we'll be talking about this in a couple of weeks, if we could come together and establish common understanding about language, about frameworks, about technology, if we could come together and do more curation of what we've already got, rather than reinventing the wheel, if we could come together and share more about what works and what doesn't work, and fueling pilot projects to actually test innovative solutions and be prepared to fail, that could be transformational. And I think it would propel Canada ahead of virtually every other country in the world. So thanks very much for sharing that.
Could I respond to that, Wendy, please?
Sure.
I think that it's a super important point. And first of all, I would say, innovation is not new to the world, as we will all know. It means new to a market. And taking something that works over here and putting it over here is perfectly legitimate. Though we do tend, as humans, have a preoccupation with something that is shiny and new, and we tend to want to always invest in something new that well, is shiny and new, that we can say, hey, look what we have developed over here. But this idea of curation, I think, is really important, particularly at a time in the kind of post-pandemic world when money is going to be in short supply, large amounts of money at scale. It is incumbent upon us to figure out ways in which we can share digital infrastructure. eCampusOntario is in the business of doing that. We are in the business of providing sandboxes for technologies, for post-secondary environments in Ontario to experiment with and then to scale. And that's our job, to foment that kind of innovation. We also are in the business of funding the creation of shareable learning objects or learning materials and open educational resources that people can create and then be reshared. My observation on this is that we are more likely to get more applicants who want to create new things than we are people who will say, oh, I really like the thing that Paula made. I am going to adapt that, or I'm going to use that. And somehow in this mix, we need to find a way to incentivize the conspicuous contribution of producing something that is useful and usable to others, plus the ability to reuse that. And by, if I am incentivized as much to create something new as I am to use something that Paula or Namir has created, then what we have done is truly create this kind of infrastructure. It assumes a shared language, but we are then getting away from just continually creating new things and finding ways to reuse that which is reusable.
It's such a good, and important point. Innovation is, and it of course, people have heard me say this before, innovation is not about making new stuff, new technology, new software, new hardware. Innovation is about doing things differently. And one of the most innovative things that we could do is a better job of mapping who's doing what, where, what works, what doesn't work, and sharing that information so that we're building on each other and the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And I do think it's not just a Canadian problem, but it's exacerbated in Canada by the fragmentation of funding, jurisdictions, and so on. So really glad to hear that eCampusOntario kind of shares that perspective. Namir, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, sort of your perspective specifically on some of the drivers around upskilling and reskilling, and especially some of the work that you've really pioneered in terms of looking at assets that people have in one sector and figuring out how you can add to those in order for them to transition to another sector, rather than constantly assuming that we need new people, when in fact, in many cases, the people that we've got could actually make a big contribution.
Delighted to highlight that. So one good example is, in fact, what we're doing with the Calgary Economic Development in Alberta, where we basically identified that Calgary, in fact, has the largest number of engineers per capita in the country. And obviously with the complexity of the environment at the moment and the resource industry and oil and gas, we started to look at how do we transition some of the workforce from the oil and gas into growth sectors of the Canadian economy, specifically in Calgary, that is actually advancing in many of these fronts that I talked about earlier in terms of the fintech, renewable energy, and others. And hence we started to figure out how do we do, first of all, identification of skills mapping. Looked at, for instance, a geoscientist and saying, how much of their skills do they have compared to a data systems engineer? And as a result, we figured out that, yes, they have almost 55% of those skills. So there's 45% that then we went ahead, partnered with academic institutions to build short duration training to make that happen. And as a result of that, the training took place with the EDGE program that's in fact with the Calgary Economic Development, and obviously with the foresight and the support of the Future Skills Center, piloting this program of 100 candidates, which we looked at the diversity, in fact, of it. Because Wendy, as you mentioned, it's not only engineers, we looked at social scientists, others that could be part of this stream. I know for a fact from all of our studies, it's impossible to bridge that labor shortage with just the STEM education in Canada. Even if we look at internationally educated professionals, we have to widen the net going forward. And obviously, we're producing micro-credentials, and I think that's a bigger discussion for all of us to have, because we have some of the industry vetted skills that we're building against, because ultimately that's what's going to be critical, is how do we train people to meet the skills of what the industry of tomorrow is looking for going on that. And I would say, I mean, wholeheartedly agree. I think there is a thrust that we have to look at how do we share our capability collectively. And the discussion that I have with Mark Patterson quite extensively, you know, very similar to the Internet of Things, could we be collectively the Internet of Solutions, that we bring it, you know, provide some of these tools and capabilities to help Canadians from all walks of life, but also in every part of their careers, whether they are in the gig economy, whether they're in the workforce, build those skills for tomorrow, because it's so critical for our competitive advantage in the next number of years.
I really, you know, it's not, I've spent a lot of my career trying to get more women into engineering, computer science, and so on. But I do think that one of the really interesting spaces right now is how we transition people who are trained as one thing into something else. And, you know, I think Namir's example is amazing. We've been doing work with taking social sciences and humanities grads and transitioning them into IT roles with the Advanced Digital and Professional Training Program. We worked with Cognizant to look at low code, no code opportunities. And I've mentioned some of those before, where you can take someone who graduated in English literature and turn them into a Java full stack developer. And I do think it's, you know, I work at a post-secondary institution. I love post-secondary institutions, but I do think we need to be thinking about some of these more flexible and adaptable models, many of which are in fact technology enabled. So thanks for bringing that up. Paula, over to you, because some of the stuff that, you know, every time I talk to you, I learn more about some of the really leading edge work that's going on in corporations to create more inclusive environments. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the things that you've seen and how they contribute to this discussion?
Absolutely. And I'll just sort of add a commentary on the last point as well, because it's some of the work that has been done to sort of transition people in careers has been astounding and phenomenal. I would only add that it's important to have an infrastructure when doing that really takes into account the person and what they want, what they're suitable for in terms of their own perceptions, because you can be successful in the training, but not successful in the career. You can be successful in the skills, but not necessarily be successful in how somebody is going to be able to contribute, because it might be counter to their own personal style and what they want for themselves. So I would just put that out there as something that needs to be systematized as much as anything else. And, you know, I won't go, you know, too deeply into the value of diversity in making sure, because I think we should all understand that the business case has been clear. Diverse organizations do better. You have that mix of thought. I'm only saying that because I think sometimes it isn't top of mind. But also it's important in this way of reskilling people. So what's been happening is really more of a personalization in terms of the whole path of training. So you have a certain level of criteria, but how you interact with your training platform, how you interact with your experience, the more it can be personalized, the more you are able to include people. So there are a number of different technologies that helps people with various sort of learning styles, abilities, neurodiversity that we need to consider. We also need to consider, whether we do have any kind of cultural bias in how we're moving forward, because that'll make it more difficult for people to absorb. All of that, I think, is all about the enabling. So you have your information, you have the way you're presenting it, but how it actually gets incorporated in people's minds is a different thing. The other thing is thinking about how people learn, just generally speaking. So if you think about how you've learned language or you've learned different skills, it hasn't been a big dump of information. That's not how any of us learn. So the incorporation of learning and progress as part of one's experience. So there's microlearning opportunities, some of which are very good, some of which, could use a little bit of work in terms of, the original premise, which is to put bits and pieces of information in people's minds, have it become a part of their thinking, and continuously reinforcing it. So we want to make sure that we're considering that. We also want to make sure that we're considering the broad range of skills that need to be available to us. So there's technical skills. There's also skills in terms of connection, with customers, with colleagues, etc. So having a platform that includes that. So inside your organization, you not only have diverse individuals, but you also have a true diversity of skill sets. So it's not just hard skills, it is skills that will help you connect with your customers, have colleagues connect with one another. And as I mentioned before, the mental and emotional resilience to deal with the change that we've all been facing and will face more.
And the point that you make is so critically important. It's part of the reason why all of us are so committed, for example, to work integrated learning as a way of combining the learning of the skills, the application of the skills. And whether we're talking about, newcomers learning English, whether we're talking about university students and graduates transitioning into employment, I do think that the investments around that are probably among the most important investments that the federal government can make, because the evidence is so clear that you can learn so much more with a well-designed work integrated learning program than you do sitting in a classroom. You don't learn surfing from a textbook, and there's so many skills you cannot learn other than in context. So super.
The thing I'd sort of add to that, Wendy, is that we want to make sure. I mean, in an ideal situation, you have an organization that is a learning organization that actually provides that value to their people. It's an excellent aspect of a brand, in addition to bringing skills in. But when you have that work integrated learning inside your organization, you're also giving the people an opportunity to feel successful and positive as they're moving forward with this journey. You're making a point that this is sort of an ongoing and career a career length type of experience. And think of what that does in terms of your potential for retention. So you're giving people the opportunity to feel successful. You're giving them the long-term view in terms of how you operate, as opposed to you're investing in a training and then that person has skills that they can take elsewhere.
Yeah, thanks.
I think that's one of the reasons why we have such low apprenticeship completion rates in this country actually is because employers are generally afraid to invest in their apprentices because they're afraid that their competitors will then reap the benefit. There is a distinct lack of collective concern for the elevation of the entire workforce. There are many other reasons for lack of or low apprentice completion rates. I mean, the treatment of how they interact with the post-secondary environment among them. But I really like your point about learning organization, Paula. That's a noun and a verb, as I would understand it. It is a thing that we do, but it is also a practice that we engage. And something else you mentioned made me kind of harken back to the earlier discussion of micro-credentials. And I think it's worth talking about that because we understand that micro-credentials are a thing. I happen to be a proponent of them. And many of the technologies that we see are either routes to acquiring a micro-credential or things that you use, technologies you use when you get that certification or whatever. And I think we have an interesting kind of inflection point. I read this article recently about it was in the BBC. It was the 20th anniversary of Napster. I don't know if anybody remembers Napster, but back in the day before we streamed all of our music, Napster came along and disrupted the music industry. We're in the same moment right now. Like, think back to then, record company, here's your record. You can buy this record. Me, I only want that one song. Record company, buy this record. That's the only way to get your one song. Okay, I guess I'm going to buy the record. It's not like that anymore. I can go and get my one song. It's a very similar model with credentials right now. And I think that it's an instructive lesson to think about what Napster did and what streaming did, and what frankly Apple did with putting a technology infrastructure in with good design that presaged this kind of move towards more iterative and agile approaches to acquiring things that I wanted to, in this case, listen to. But I think the post-secondary environment would do well to think about those kinds of lessons and the disruption that had, and to think about the ways in which we might want to play a role in shaping the future of micro-credentials. Because here's my fear. I mean, it's great that Shopify's, a Canadian company, largest Canadian company, and saying, like others like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and others, that you don't need a college or a university degree. We will train you. We will give you a micro-credential. That's all well and fine. My fear there is that reifies aspects of the gig economy that we probably might not want to reify, and that it disengages or disenfranchises the learner because it assumes that you are only that person coming into that company doing that particular skill for which you were getting a micro-credential. The value of the public post-secondary education producing credentialed people, be they micro or macro or meso or whatever, is that credential is functionally a fungible asset anywhere in the marketplace, not in one company, in one job, or in one sector. And that's a very, very important point that I think we should all remember, those of us who are working in post-secondary and micro-credentials, is that we would want to ensure that the learners that we are supporting have agency across their careers, that we teach them how to learn, but also agency across a career in a different place. And I think I was on a panel 3 years ago, back in the day when you could do this in person, at the Scotiabank, because they were doing a learning panel. And it was the head of HR for Scotiabank, and I apologize because I do not remember her name, but she talked about Scotiabank's onboarding and offboarding process. And this was really interesting to me. I didn't know this, that they had this really complicated, not complicated, but in-depth process to onboard employees, but also to offboard employees when they decided they wanted to go somewhere else. And what came out in her presentation was that because, and I'm sure many do this, this is just the example that I recall, they said, they may be a customer of Scotiabank for life. They may want to come back to Scotiabank at some point in time when they go to work at TD or RBC or wherever. And it's incumbent upon us to A, support them on the way in, B, support them in the organization to learn as much as possible, and C, support them when they want to leave, because we want them to be a good, productive member of society, and they might just come back to us and be even better. So they are an example of a Canadian company, and I'm sure there are many, who are investing in the agency of their people, of their workers and their learners, in order to create a rising tide to lift all boats.
Yeah, no, really good points. The only thing I would, and I'm going to give Stephen a chance to chime in, but I want to hear from Mark. The only thing that I would say, Robert, is I think when we're thinking about the system, post-secondary institutions play a piece of the role, but I would love to extend what you're talking about across the system, including the different stakeholders, because I do think that that's one of the things that we have to increasingly recognize is that universities and colleges have a piece of it, but what will be more effective is if we can bring all of the pieces together. Mark, you've been very patient. I know you've got lots to say. Did you want to talk a little bit about your perspective on, you've talked a bit about the idea of platforming, but I wonder specifically about some of the diversity and inclusion things that we've talked about and some of the work you're doing at Magnet.
Oh, I think again, I'm going to, so keeping in mind all the points that, you know, anything is a double-edged sword, technology. There are both sides. Robert made some really important points in the opening question. One of the things we've been focused on is, again, looking at that issue of fragmentation. And so it's not only at the technology level, but if you think about, for example, and just one example, where are new immigrants supported in their transitioning into the workforce? There's a whole system in communities of community-based organizations supporting newcomers. And yet, how can an employer actually reach out to those organizations? So those organizations aren't telling their clients or the job seekers they're supporting necessarily to look on Indeed. They're saying, look on our job board of our organization. And I can tell you, there are not many organizations, employers on the call can think about your approach, but even large recruiting organizations with huge, say, campus recruiting might go to 12 institutions of the 197, or might go to one or two of the, you know, community-based employment service organizations. So your point about the other side of the system, Wendy, becomes really important, because often those that are most marginalized are being supported in community organizations, and those organizations are hard to reach. So there's that system level. How do we bring that together? How do we allow opportunity to find talent instead of employers fishing in the same pool over and over and then just complaining that the talent doesn't exist, when we actually, those of us working on the front lines, know it does in many cases. So that's one piece of it. I think the other piece, you know, there's a lot of really interesting work going on. We've talked briefly about unconscious bias, and Wendy, you mentioned in the presentation around even something as simple as a name that might not be Canadian, so to speak, and the impact that that can have on a person's ability to even get an interview. So we have a lot of work to do. There are technologies that are looking, and several companies have made a point of stripping out in reviewing applications, whether you do it in the technology layer or at the HR layer when it goes to the hiring manager, removing the names of the employees, the location where they went to school, etc. And so I think it's not one thing. I don't think there's going to be one kind of technological panacea that's going to solve all of these challenges. But I think it's really important we keep an eye on engaging the whole system that is supporting diverse populations, making sure we're looking at, you know, issues around systemic bias in our recruiting and hiring practices. We always talk, and it's important, and Paula mentioned, it's clear, the research is clear that diverse organizations you know, drive innovation, and the benefits are clear from the research. But we also have to remember that we need to have organizations that can manage diversity. So are we training the organizations to manage diverse teams? Because without that, you could potentially have conflict. So there's all of these pieces. There is no one simple solution, but I would go back to, I think, what I mentioned earlier on, is I think we're, you know, a country that could come together in some of these areas to, again, share best practices, share what works, what's been proven to work, and have a more, you know, less fragmented approach to how we can help employers connect to the system, where we're, frankly, we're spending billions and billions of dollars as taxpayers supporting populations, but not really working together. So it's exciting to see all the innovation happening. I would really like to see a digital infrastructure that we can plug in new innovation and not build a toolkit that has all of these different tools that can be used in different situations, not create a new toolkit every time the government wants to fund a new project. Because a lot of this does come from the way we're incented as organizations to support and the way we're funded. The fragmentation is really driven from that. So a lot of issues, but I think that would be really important. And when we're looking at those most underrepresented in the labor market, there's no easy solutions, but we do need to come together on a bunch of these areas.
So interesting, because if you look at, you look at someone who's doing a pitch or a business case for, a new product or service, the expectation is the starting point is always to say, how am I differentiated? How is the product or service that I'm offering different from all the stuff that is in the market? And there's an expectation that you will actually look at the market and define what it is you're adding or contributing or how you're going to do something that doesn't already exist. And what I would observe right across the funding landscape, those are questions that are very seldom asked. And it's part of the reason, to your point, that people are not incentivized to build on the work of others, but rather, often reinventing the wheel. Stephen, I don't see you, but I think you're still there. I just wondered, based on the conversation so far, if there was anything that you would like to add based on what's been said.
Yeah, I'd like to keep hearing from the panel, but I thought I'd just sort of level a challenge at this stage, because one of the things I'm hearing a lot about here is how we need to build the system well, and I can't help but agree. But at the same time, I think there's a tension, which is how can we go a lot faster? The data that we showed off the top just says over and over and over again that we have a challenge that's already here, is accelerating, and is going to cost our economy a lot of money. And I worry that sometimes when we wait for the perfect system, Robert, I take your points about the need to pay attention to ethics. I agree, but I think we need to pay attention to ethics while we're experimenting, not in order of operations. And look at just the huge irony that many Canadians don't have sufficient connectivity to take part in the digital economy, while at the same time we're leveraging internet connections in areas of Africa for extremely low cost. That we have to get past these barriers and just get things done. I think there's going to be an uncomfortable period where we're both trying to build the right system, but also hopefully encouraging people to go much faster at the same time. And that's a difficult tension to manage. I'm interested in what folks have to say to that.
I know that everyone agrees in principle with this. If we're talking about innovation, we're talking about iteration, we're talking about strategic action. We're not talking about studying everything and assuming we will have proof before we can move, because innovation and hard evidence are often antithetical. We have to be prepared to try things, fail, and move quickly to kill what doesn't work and invest in what does. I wanted at this, I know there's some audience questions, so I thought maybe I'd hand the talking stick back to Elaine, who's been monitoring some of the chat, so that in our last few minutes we can get some of those questions taken care of. So thanks very much, Elaine.
Great, thank you very much, Wendy, and really interesting discussion. Thank you for all of our panelists that were able to respond to the many different topics that we explored. Thank you, Wendy, for moderating. We do have a number of questions. We are going to try to get to them today. Some of them are really specific, so we'll do our best. I'm going to start with a big open question to the whole panel. So feel free for one or two of you to jump in as you feel fit. And this is really about the importance of coordinated efforts in achieving this type of transformation. The big question from the audience is, how do we achieve this? If we have to increase our investment in skills training in many levels above the current levels, it's obviously going to cost more money. So who should be leading this change? For example, should it be government, post-secondary institutions, corporations? And who will bear the cost or given the big cost involved in this, are they also prepared to fail? So just throw that open to the panel in terms of how do we begin making this transformation process, and who really should be the one leading this.
Mark, go ahead.
Well, I would argue that there's a lot of efficiency, at least in the publicly funded side of the system. There's a lot of efficiency that actually could come if we thought about it at a systems level. So some of the things we were talking about before, what may surprise people is how much we actually spend on our employment and training system across Canada. And there have been lots of audits and companies across, provinces and territories across the country around the value of what we're spending. So don't get me wrong, there are thousands of amazing organizations with thousands of people working in those organizations that are doing amazing work on the ground, but at a systems level, it's not producing the results we need for the country. So I actually think there's a lot of opportunity for more efficiency across the system. And I'll just give you one example. If you could make it easy for an employer to post an opportunity and distribute to that publicly funded system, they actually have to spend less money in having HR people just go to 1,000 different job posting sites. Like, that's just one simple example. So there's a lot of efficiency that could be found across the system. If we're talking about the publicly funded system, which is very large, I think obviously that's the jurisdiction of the provinces and territories, but I think we need to be looking at issues where we cross jurisdictional boundaries. Labor is not tied to one province or territory. With employers, I think it was touched on already. There's this fear in Canada to train. Some organizations are taking a leadership in their ecosystem of suppliers and related companies to train. So there's companies like DeFasco and others that hire twice as many interns and apprenticeship as they need because they know that their supply chain needs them. The question. So I think there's a real need for more investment, but at a systems level and thinking about the greater good. And I don't know that it would actually drive a lot more costs into the actual system compared to what we're spending now.
Yeah, maybe there.
I have a point just, sorry, I have a point just to add to that, and it kind of builds on Stephen's point as well. I think we should really, I can't think of a better way to say it, but be a bit embarrassed about how slow we are moving on a number of things. And I think what really kind of brings that home is how quickly we moved in response to this pandemic on a number of things. It's clear that we have the capability. It's clear that we have the intelligence. It's clear that we can do more much faster, but we just don't. And I do think that there does need to be that kind of sense of urgency or emergency, as my Freudians would say, to sort of move things forward, and also a sense of responsibility, because even what happened with the pandemic, organizations responded because they needed to keep in business. That's what organizations do. I need to be competitive. I need to keep in business. I need to make sure that my people are well supported so I can do both of those things. And I'm going to do what it takes to do that. Governments have a responsibility to the society as a whole, making sure that we have infrastructure to even stay relevant. So they have to take action in terms of their sphere of responsibility. And if everybody is pointing to everybody else, then it never moves forward. If everybody tries to solve every problem and have multiple focuses, then we never move forward. So it even is just one step at a time, and then we can move a fair bit more quickly. And what I would hope is that we not have that, or my comment, be academic, but we actually just do it. Because again, it is completely embarrassing that there are so many things that we're not doing, when clearly, if we have a national or global crisis, we can get moving. So let's remember that and start to get moving on this and a few other things that are quite critical.
Yeah, maybe if I can add another point on this discussion. I think we're all in agreement. I think creating efficiencies in terms of the learning resources, the content, the capabilities and making it as broad as possible to include all the talent and all the human capital in Canada is going to be critical. And I always argue that it's not only a social imperative, it's an economic imperative. We have to do that to compete in a global environment. But I would think that I would argue that there is a step even before that we have to also collaborate on, is getting many of the companies, give them the awareness of why technology is important for them to adopt, and not only for the survivability, but to thrive in the world in the future. Much of the calls that I receive from the industry is one's asking me, if it's a brick and mortar retailer, why should I go into e-commerce, or what would that provide me in capabilities? We have to drive also digital adoption and help that digital adoption. I think there is a role for us collectively to play, not only on the talent that we all agree, but also on the capacity building of organizations to give them the impetus to start adopting these technologies and become more competitive on the world stage. And there are a lot of tools that we can collectively develop. We're looking at this as an organization. I'm sure others are. And we have to look at the two sides of the fence, capacity building for organizations, but the talent development as well.
Great. Thank you very much, Namir. I've got a question that is raised to Wendy and Stephen, but perhaps others can weigh in as well. And this is about post-secondary students. How do they go about developing deep technology skills? Not all students will become experts on coding, or should they? There's a comment that the job market is changing and young college and university students may not be prepared for the market, and the post-secondary education itself is not able to respond as quickly. We're going to combine that with another item that participant raised that Stephen had mentioned. The pace of change required means we can't use the same 20th century approach to learning anymore. So just as a background or comment that was brought up. So to Wendy and Stephen and to anybody else, what should post-secondary students do, and how do they develop these types of technology skills?
You know, I don't want to be hawking my wares, but I am such a strong believer in the opportunity for work integrated learning, not just for students who are enrolled in post-secondary, although clearly it's important, but I think where it's most important is what I would call the valley of death. Like once a student graduates, helping them transition into work. And I teach in the business school, but I can tell you, I can teach you what I remember from my MBA in a couple of weeks. You know, we can teach someone how to become a big data analyst in a short period of time. We can teach people how to use, you know, develop expert skills with Excel, SQL, Tableau, tools. And I think we have to differentiate between tools and skills. The tools that are in demand in business, regardless of what your academic background is. So while I believe that post-secondary institutions are trying to change and trying to be more relevant, I think the biggest opportunities are actually in micro-credentials, short intensive, work integrated learning experiences that can be continuously updated and regraded. So, you know, the ADAPT program, we have students from 20 universities, 600 have gone through the program, 88% placement rates, huge success, whether you were an English major or an engineer. And I think that's why I'm very keen on thinking about these new models, flexible approaches, and really not training people for jobs that don't exist. You have to engage employers before you start the training process, so you're sure that what you're producing has a market.
I'll just quickly add that a few years ago, we wrote a paper, and one of the questions that was asked of us is, what is a universal capability that everybody needs to learn? And we had a lot of stuff up on the whiteboard, but in the end, we ended up with the ability to seek, find, and make use of information, which seems ironic to say in a time when you can Google it. But my advice to students is steal this education. Whatever it is you think you want to learn, Google it. Yeah, I went through this with one of my teen sons this weekend. He wants to learn to code, and he said, "Well, I'm almost in university. I'll finally be able to learn." I took him to Khan Academy. I took him to sites all across. I mean, there are tons of ways that he doesn't have to wait, and he can do it for free. So I think we have not, as students, and we're all students, taken enough advantage of the information that's available to us. Should we become independent learners rather than institutionalized learners?
Yeah, maybe I can add to that. I think there's a combination of the two. Let me start by saying, I think as a country, we have one of the top academic institutions from around the world. The gap is between the academic institutions and the industry is actually smaller, much smaller than we believe. It is the question of how do we give them industry context capabilities? Apart from the skills that we discussed a little earlier in terms of the communications, collaboration, agility, resourcefulness, and others, is if you have a software engineer graduating from a top university working for the e-commerce, they need to know if they're going to work for the health sector and telemedicine is how to basically develop the capabilities and the programming for that industry. Because the e-commerce has a different need to the health sector of doing analysis, of understanding the effective immunization on the larger population or effective medication on larger population. So hence, industry contextual environment is going to be important. But the gap is much smaller than we think. And that's where programming like Will and others that we need to accelerate going forward is going to help us maintain that competitive environment and help specifically the very small companies that represent the larger majority of our economy to be able to acquire that innovative talent ready for the workforce of tomorrow.
I would just also point out, I think there's an element here of motivation of individuals as well, and also employers giving the space to learn. I mean, I've spoken a lot of times around lifelong learning, and most audiences grown, like they think they can do 4 years of school and then, it's done. I've got that out of the way, and I can, focus on my family or all of the other pressures that we all face in our life. And, we see lots of examples of companies where it's very clear, like telecommunications, where, telecommunications workers are having a hard time getting people to understand the need to upskill into 5G technologies. So even when it's being trained internally at the organization and for free. So there are other factors that can either restrict or be barriers to motivation of an individual to be advancing their skills. And I think we have to keep that in mind as well.
I'd just like to sort of build on that quickly as well. Because so number one, I couldn't agree more that the most important skill is the ability to learn. But I also am very sort of sensitive to what an organization needs to have in place in order to be successful, and what relationship it needs to have with their employees. And this conversation would be terrifying to a certain proportion of the employee population. Like if is part of it, and part of the way that people might inappropriately perceive it is, do I need to be a software engineer? Do I need to be a data scientist? Do I need to be, any of these roles in order to be relevant in my innovative organization? And for sure, that's not the case. But sometimes that's not really translated into how organizations communicate with their people, or even what's top of mind for them. So we know that, for example, if you have data scientists, you don't have people who can actually translate that data, then that's, in real world terms, that's not helpful. We know that, the greatest technical teams need people managers who may or may not have technical backgrounds in order to enable their capability. We know that there are a number of roles that need to be functioning well and supportive of this innovative organization. And we just sort of put that out there, that we can't forget that there is a diversity of roles as well. So I just wanted to make that point again.
And I'll just add one very quick point to that, is that, because we have not talked about this yet, and that is that we've inferred it, the ability to work in teams.
Yeah.
Right? We have a propensity to focus, like if I look at the research and innovation idea to innovation like line, we focus on the sole inventor over here, or the person who is the CEO or the chief selling officer of the company. We do not focus in the middle of that on the team that is required to make a whole bunch of things work well. And if we, I mean, it's great to think about empowering the individuals, but when we empower the individuals to the detriment of the team or society, then we've got a bunch of people who know how, we've got like an all-star sport team that can't work together.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I'm sorry to have to cut off our conversation short because it has been such an invaluable discussion. You've given us lots to think about. So thank you very much, Paula, Namir, Mark, and Robert. Of course, I want to say a big thank you to Stephen and Wendy for presenting the highlights of the report, and to say thank you to Diversity Institute and Future Skills Center and Public Policy Forum for their support of this research paper. Everyone who registered today will be getting a copy of the report. You can follow the Diversity Institute on Twitter at Ryerson DI, or feel free to connect on other social media channels. It was my pleasure today to moderate the session. Thank you for the wonderful opportunity, Wendy. And certainly if you want to stick around for a few minutes, we can try to have a couple of more informal questions. But for now, thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job, Elaine, bringing us.
Thanks, Elaine.
Wonderful.
Sorry.